Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. And I think we're maybe 75% of the way. So at this point, we'll get seated and we'll open this up to hear the great wisdom and counsel from Paul McCulley. And I think everybody's back here, Paul. So let's welcome Paul McCulley to the stand, professor of the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. He's one of our favorite longtime speakers, and you're going to be fully entertained and brought up to date.
Thanks, Scott. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Wow. Very, very interesting morning. I really enjoyed it. And I'm going to try to riff in some respects off of this morning, as well as some of my own thoughts as well. It's great to be back in Teton Springs. It really is. And to actually be in a tent. And I was thinking this morning when I was sitting in the back of the room, it reminded me of my youth to be sitting in a meeting room like this in a tent, because I grew up as a Baptist minister's son. Some of you have figured that out before, I think. And there was such a thing back then, I don't know about now, of a tent revival meeting. And this would have been a really high class tent revival meeting from when I grew up a long time ago. I turned 65 this year. But I was thinking in terms of something my dad told me actually a few years before he passed away at 89. So it wasn't a tragedy or anything, but he and I got quite close in his later years. I was actually retired. So we were two old men talking about life. And I asked him, reflecting on his 50 years in the ministry, if there was anything that, sort of really crystallized about, being behind the pulpit all the time. He said, son, he always called me son, yeah, that every sermon should have only 3 points. If you have more than 3 points, you're going to lose them. And he was quite the theologian and could speak in great detail about a lot of things. But he had learned that at the pulpit, 3 points was the maximum, or he would lose the audience. And he looked at me with this wry smile and he said, and the 3 points were always the same. And of course, I had to take the bait. Okay, Dad, what were the 3 points? He said, real simple. Stop your sinning, do more good, and give more money. And I reflected on it, and he was right. We had a good chuckle about it. He says it changes Sunday to Sunday on the weights that you put on the three variables. Sometimes you lean heavy on the stop the sinning. Sometimes you lean heavy on do more good. And sometimes you lean heavy on the give more money. So he says you're always just mixing these three things away. And if you're a little light on the budget, you can go straight to point 3. Probably some of you have had that experience in sermons that you've heard, right? Sometimes the minister will go directly to point 3, give more money. And I remember I was chatting with Dad about that. And I said, in many respects, it's quite similar in my old business. I was retired at the time, which was working as a fund manager and investment management firm. And I said, I speak to a lot of audiences, but ultimately it comes down to 3 points. Take the long-term view, be opportunistic, and let me manage more of your money. For those in the audience that are investment managers, is that basically your stock speech? Take the long-term view, be opportunistic, and let me manage more of your money. And I was thinking about that architecture when I was listening to this morning, and actually skipping point 3 on managing the money. In that the first 2 points, I think, were brought out very, very well today by both Chris and Paul and the panel and David. When there was a strong, robust focus on take the long-term view. Take the long-term view. And I think that was particularly critical in the whole conversation of the importance of re-anchoring inflation appreciably lower than where we are right now. And I think that also morphed into the second point, be opportunistic, which is the whole issue of will restoring price stability induce a recession? So I really appreciate it this morning because it fit both a secular view and a cyclical view. And then Paul's conversation, and he explicitly does short, medium, and long term. And actually, I had a lot to agree with everything that was said this morning. I have one bone of contention. I want to use it as my starting point today. This room and our collective speakers are just too damn pessimistic. Just too pessimistic. So I actually want to give you a little bit of optimism to kick off this afternoon. We unambiguously right now have what could be described as stagflation. And we haven't had that in a long period of time. And it feels awful. It feels awful. And a number of people, including John, are saying the stag is morphing into recession. I don't really want to get deep into that debate with him, but I'm certainly willing to stipulate, as the lawyers in the room would say, that we now have stagflation. It's very unpleasant, particularly to younger people who have never experienced the thing, and that it has profound negative political implications for Mr. Biden. I'm willing to stipulate all of those things. All of them are true, but they don't warrant, in my viewpoint, extreme pessimism. They simply don't. And there's a key reason. We've had, over the last 2.5 years, a rolling series of shocks. Unanticipated things coming over the transom that threw our economy dramatically out of some theoretical equilibrium. That's what shocks do. If you get one, that's pretty nasty. But if you get a series of them, then you got rolling shocks. And bad things can happen. Bad things happen. when you have shocks. We're sitting here 2.5 years later, and the bad thing that we have is stagflation. Relative to the alternative, that's not a bad outcome. I think in terms of 2 years ago, when we literally were not in this room, because we could not have the Rocky Mountain Summit in July of 2020. And at that juncture, we were suffering for the first time in my lifetime what I call a macro act of God. If you want to be more technical, call it a macro force majeure event, otherwise known as COVID. Unlike other recessions, and particularly the Great Recession associated with the financial crisis, this shock, the COVID shock, was a genuine act of God, not an act of human hubris and greed. And that's what the Great Recession and the financial crisis was about. God did not invent the subprime mortgage. God didn't lever the subprime mortgage half the distance to the moon. God didn't invent the shadow banking system. We did that to ourselves back prior to the great financial crisis, and it blew up. And there was a nasty long spell afterward, a truly nasty long spell. And going back to the tent revival, you could say that was our comeuppance, if you will, for our sin of hubris and greed. COVID was not the consequence of what we did. It truly was an act of God, and it was actually unique in how it affected our economy. It had the potential to be absolutely nefarious. Absolutely nefarious. And it didn't turn out that way. Notwithstanding what David was talking about, which is really serious issues, very serious issues. From a macro perspective, we're back to full employment. 2 years later, from when we didn't have a conference here 2 years ago, we're back to full employment. And the biggest complaint, and a justifiable complaint, is that the cost of living has moved up approximately 10% over the last year. Very, very unpleasant. But actually, I look at that and think in terms of, if you had told me that, told us collectively, virtually, if we'd had a conference in 2020, that we were going to get through the COVID pandemic, and that 2 years later, our economy would be fully reopened, we would be at full employment. But the price tag of that was going to be a 10% increase in the cost of living. I submit a lot of us would have said, yep, please, I'll take that outcome. I'll take that outcome. Because you think in terms of where we were in July 2020, life had been turned entirely on its head. And that was before we had vaccines. So we were all frozen. We were all frozen. 2 years later, we are unfrozen. And the most popular word these days about economic data is hot. Things are too hot. Labor market's hot. Inflation's hot. Stock market's not hot anymore, but we're at hot right now. And so I'd like us to think in terms of not belly aching continuously all the time about the inflation right now, or even belly aching about the notion that the stagflation may morph into something a little bit less pleasant. That we've got to take that longer term view. And the longer term view is longer than 2 years for us as citizens. And I think that shock we have absorbed. I mentioned that we have a series of shocks, and we have 2 other ones that we've had over the last 2 years. So again, you had the biggie and you had 2 others, and we're still standing with our biggest complaint that we are experiencing a stagflationary outcome. Now, let me talk about the other 2 shocks pretty quickly. But to do that, I think it's important to understand what the policy response was to the big one. The policy response was to the big one. Actually, I think the policy response was really, really cool. I know when we all look back in retrospect, we will say that, and I would not disagree with this, we will say that the policy response, fiscal policy and monetary policy response, in retrospect, was too big and it lasted too long, as evidenced by the fact that we have the inflation now. It's really difficult to argue with that notion that it was too big and it lasted too long. From my perspective, however, is it was big and it was quick. And I am truly amazed that our democracy was able to do what it did in the spring of 2020. The fact that what we did as the Democratic Republic turned out to be probably a little bit too big with too long a half-life, acknowledged. The fact that we did it was absolutely huge, because it really was a macro force majeure event, which had a direct impact on how we have our capitalist economy structured. A macro force majeure event that requires our collective agent, otherwise known as our government, to shut us down, In fact, we would have shut ourselves down, I think, in any event. But when you shut down the economy, you are suspending for that moment the notion of treating your economy as a going concern. Because our wonderful capitalist economy is founded on contracts, private contracts that require regular obedience to the payment terms and the covenant terms. Put differently, the contracts, the legal contracts, which are the foundation of capitalism. You couldn't have capitalism without legally enforceable contracts. The pandemic and the shutdown called into question whether or not the contracts of private sector capitalism could be treated as going concerns, because capitalism was put in the cellar, And that was a unique moment in time when we as a society had to have a very steamy affair with democratic socialism. I said it at the time, not because I'm a democratic socialist. I'm a democratic capitalist. But that was a unique period in time where essentially the balance sheet of our government had to step in and bridge the contracts of the private capitalist system to the other side of the act of God. Capitalism was in a state of suspended animation for good reason, and we needed to essentially make the contracts underlying capitalism be treated as macro good. Simply put, what we needed to do was have the sovereign replace the income or guarantee the contracts of the private sector until we could get to the other side of the act of God, which actually turned out to be inside of a year. As the vaccines came on in early 21, and by the time we got to the spring of 21, the economy was back to being good old-fashioned capitalist economy. And so there was a 1 year, essentially a 1 year interval where we had to have this steamy affair with democratic socialism, which was implemented on both the fiscal policy side and the monetary policy side. For that 1 year period, essentially, we as a nation ran fiscal policy and monetary policy as a consolidated balance sheet. Put differently, we de facto suspended central bank independence from the fiscal authority for a year. It was actually the right thing to do, because if you have private sector capitalism put into a induced coma. That's really what we're talking about, an induced coma with an outstanding array of contracts, then you need the full united force of the sovereign, including a printing press for money and helicopters to distribute it across the country, both to those who were involuntarily unemployed and to businesses, which we did obviously through the PPP loans. That was the right approach. And it worked. It worked. In fact, in retrospect, we could say it worked too well, but it worked. And that's the message I really want us to focus on here this afternoon is, yes, let's recognize what it means for us to have to deal with a stagflationary problem. It matters for your business. It matters for your investment portfolio. So all of that's really, really important, but let's not lose sight of the fact that we as a nation did the right thing. And we did it with dispatch. We did it with vigor. And we also did it in a bipartisan way in 2020. And in this polarized society and polarized political arena that we deal with, that we are living with and have been living with for a long period of time, that was nothing short of a miracle. We were sitting here in the summer of 22 talking about high quality problems. We're talking about high quality problems. 2 years ago, we weren't talking about high quality problems. So keep that in mind. Now, in transitioning to the other two shocks that we've had, let's, again, using the legal term of stipulation, say that that 1 year affair with democratic socialism, and you certainly need a society-wide response to a macro force majeure event, that once we had gotten to the end of that bridge, which was essentially the spring of 21, about a year after the whole thing, that once we got across the bridge, we needed to end the affair. We needed to end our national, very steamy affair with democratic socialism. And in fact, that's what we've been trying to do ever since, with varying degrees of success. But essentially, it was a 1 year window, required an extraordinary response. Once we got to the other side of the bridge, we needed to go back to the conventional thinking that our economy is driven by capitalism. It's not driven by government. It's driven by the marketplace. We did. We also needed to separate again fiscal and monetary policy. Once we got to the other side of the bridge, we needed to restore the central bank's independence from the fiscal authority. The Fed's been doing that in dramatic and wonderful fashion, in my viewpoint, ever since November of last year. So if the Fed's going to be charged with being guilty of staying too long at the party, spiking the punch with too much grain alcohol, I think they should cop a plea and essentially say, we were guilty for 6 months. That's max. That's the max criticism I will give the Fed for being late to start reestablishing its independence. And make no mistake, the Fed pivoted last November. They didn't hike rates until March of this year, but forward guidance is the sharp end of monetary policy. It's an incredibly powerful tool. And when Jay Powell and company pivoted rhetorically last November, that would have been a damn good time to sell your stock portfolio. A really good time. And that basically, we're saying the affair with democratic socialism, the affair with modern monetary theory is over. And you can think in terms of 6 months. 6 months. We got to quit beating up on the Fed. They were maybe 6 months late. Now, during that period, that 6 months, we had another shock, not on the order of the pandemic at all, not an act of God, but fundamentally a shock to the system, in that the November election plus the January 21 election. It's important to add the second one, the January 21 election in Georgia, which flipped the Senate. So we came into 21 effectively getting ready to exit the act of God shock. And then we as a people decided, and here I'm not taking a viewpoint on it at all, it's just a simple observation, to elect a unified way left of center government. And that newly elected government, and Paul Ryan spoke from this platform last year about it, operated as if it had a mandate, to satisfy the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. So therefore, even though we had the vaccines, they were rolling them out, the new administration, not criticizing them at all, I understand why they did what they did, decided we want to have another layer, another dose, another helicopter of democratic socialism in the spring of 21 with the Recovery Act. I understand politically why it was necessary, because the Democrats flipped the Senate on the whole notion that, yes, Mr. Trump was right. It should have been a $2,000 helicopter check going to everyone. We only sent them $600. Let's send them another $1,400. And that unemployment sort of thing, yeah, let's have another 6 months of that as well. So we got an extra dollop of democratic socialism in 21. And that was a shock. That was a shock, because theoretically and practically speaking, the economy was getting ready to take off. which is why when I trace it back in terms of standpoint of what should the Fed plead guilty to, I come back to that 6 months. Because effectively in March of 21, we got the unnecessary, generous, extra dollop of helicopter money, otherwise known as sending checks to everybody while the Fed was essentially doing QE. That's essentially the definition of helicopter money. So at that juncture, you can make the case in retrospect, the Fed should have said, okay, we got the vaccines, they're rolling out, the economy's roaring back, and we got fiscal authorities sending out helicopters. We need to get off the dime here and reestablish our independence. I can make that case, but again, it's a 6-month sin. That's all. It's a 6-month sin. And in fact, when we entered this year, we were actually in a good place. We were in a good place. That extra dollop of fiscal policy was running out. Wasn't needed, but it was running out. And looking out to 22, there was clear that we were going to have fiscal drag in 22. So we weren't going to be stoking aggregate demand with fiscal policy in 22. In fact, we were going the other direction. So we started 22 with fiscal policy having corrected itself, simply because there was a cliff in the law, quite frankly. And Build Back Better turned out to be a 3-wood in a lake, politically speaking. So we were in a good place on the fiscal policy side, and we were actually in a good place on the monetary policy side, because Jay and all of his colleagues, and Chris had just joined not too long before that, basically said, we're in the wrong place. Zero is really the wrong place. And we really need to stop printing money, buying bonds here. We need to normalize policy. So you had fiscal policy shifting from stimulus to drag. You had monetary policy full-throated into a normalization process, which led to which brings us to the third shock, which is Ukraine. Not an act of God, unless you believe in a God that is different from the one I believe in, but truly was an exogenous event. Let's put it that way. It wasn't a function of sins that we had committed on Wall Street in America. It was conceptually an exogenous event. And that compounded the residual inflationary fumes of the affair with democratic socialism. But just shock after shock after shock. But now we're sitting here right now. We're at full employment. We've got a hot labor market. It's hotter than it was any time between the financial crisis and the pandemic. That's a good thing. That's a good thing. In fact, it's something in retrospect, perhaps the Fed should have tried to engineer back in the teens, if you will, because self-evidently they were too tight during the teens because they never could get up to a 2% inflation rate. So we're sitting here now, we've got fiscal policy moving in the drag direction in a big time way. This is a big swing. We got monetary policy moving that direction, already has the forward curve priced at restrictive. So let's not get wrapped around the axle that we're going to repeat the 1970s. We made some mistakes, but we also achieved an amazing amount as a nation over the last 2 years, and we're doing the course corrections that are required right now. And so I am optimistic. I share Paul Ryan's perspective, not just long-term optimism, but actually short-run optimism. Can we have a recession? Yes. I'm not in that business anymore or forecasting precise numbers because I'm retired and I don't have to do that anymore. But as a practical matter, there's a lot to be said about our economy right now. So it's not time to buy canned green peas and small firearms. It just ain't. And it might just even be time to buy some financial assets that have beat you about the head and shoulders over the last 6 months. If you didn't sell last November when Jay Powell told you to sell, it's your own damn fault. Because he told you in really clear terms last November that he was going to take away the punch bowl. He did. Wall Street effectively said, okay, these valuations make absolutely no sense, and we need to remark what is fair valuation for all assets. I think we're broadly speaking in a fair value zone. And I think the crack in commodity prices over the last month is reinforcing that, because that is perceived quite correctly, I think, as the backside of a financial demand-driven bubble in commodities, not just a supply-side shock bubble in commodity prices. So there's a lot of room for optimism. Let me take my last minute after I've said all of these wonderful things about the Fed to close with something that I don't do publicly very often, is a little bit of a criticism. And Sarah Eisen on Closing Bell, who I know quite well because I do that show a lot, sometimes will tease me that I'm a Jay Powell fanboy, because I have been so incredibly supportive of him and how the Fed has conducted itself in recent years. So I say this with the bona fides of being a fanboy of the Fed, is I think right now, this debate about whether or not the Fed's going to go 75, 50, 75, or 100 in a couple weeks is not necessary. Is not necessary. To the extent that the Fed committed the sin of being 6 months late, I think they have fully atoned. And the atonement is reflected in the tightening of financial conditions. They have smacked risk appetite on Wall Street really, really hard. You have the forward curve pricing essentially a restrictive monetary policy. You have inverted the coupon curve. You have P multiples in the stock market, passing some smells test of sensibility. So the Fed's completed its atonement. It really doesn't need to prove its bona fides as an independent entity with fidelity to its dual mandate. It has done that. And actually, I would like to associate in closing. I know that Chris is here, so therefore, this is for him in some respects. And I would like to associate myself personally as one of these talking heads on the Fed with Esther George. And Esther George has huge amount of credibility as an inflation hawk. No one has ever accused Esther of being a dove. No one's ever accused in my professional lifetime the KC Fed of being a dove, to my best of knowledge. And I think she would probably, at the margin, if she was not a Fed official, say amen to the whole notion that the Fed has done a huge amount since last November, and that the Fed needs to exercise some patience. It needs to walk up the forward curve. It needs to, as Buller would say, validate what forward guidance has already done. But it doesn't need to add additional uncertainty and volatility and obsession about the implementation of walking up the forward curve. The destination has already been established. The Fed's going to tighten until it gets restrictive. How deep it has to go into restrictive depends upon how loud the economy cries uncle. That's basically the foot race. Is the economy is going to cry uncle and inflation is going to cry uncle. And right now, the forward curve is saying, you know, we think that will do it. Let's let some time pass and let's not try to have this circus, continuous circus, like we saw, you know, yesterday, today, is how many basis points is going to be. Let's focus on the destination for the Fed. The destination is the right destination. The marketplace has embraced it. Don't declare victory and go home. Declare contentment and walk up the forward curve. Don't shock it anymore. Thank you very much.